The Soviet Union was one of the greatest social experiments of our time. Could a new society be completely engineered from scratch? The answer was no, and the Union started crumbling in the late 80s. While most ex-communist states have taken efforts to de-Sovietize their country, scrubbing Stalin's legacy clean and tearing down their statues of Lenin, one small country-type thing has embraced their Soviet past. Their statues look Soviet, their parades look Soviet, their official stories sound Soviet, they kept the old flag from when they were part of the Union, and their police force is still called the KGB. This is the breakaway state of Transnistria, nestled on a strip of land between Ukraine and Moldova, which it broke off of in 1990. Although it's not officially recognized by any country, it's only operational because of Russian support. It's basically a full-fledged Russian puppet state. Russia gives the country billions in direct subsidies and aid every year, for example giving every retiree $15 a month. They station a little under 2,000 troops in the country, and most importantly, for 2 decades have given Transnistria free natural gas. Free! It's why most of the country's elites and many of its citizens consider it to be part of the Russian world, with most people being able to speak Russian and around half of Transnistrians holding a Russian passport. The Dniester River has been the traditional dividing line between the Romanian and Russian worlds for centuries. That's what Transnistria means, beyond the Dniester River, since it was the part of Moldova that was past this river. The president wants you to call it Pridnestrovia though because, quote, the T word is for Nazis. Roll the map back to World War II and the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic was created out of the territory the Soviets gained from fighting Nazi-aligned Romania. But because of the large Russian population on the Dniester's left bank, it's left from this angle, much of the state-directed investment was put here. The steel plant, cement plant, textile factory, and most importantly, the power plant were all built on the left bank. So during the MSSR, it was Transnistria which was more developed and politically important than the rest of Moldova. But then came the surprisingly non-violent collapse of the Soviet Union. Transnistria was one of the few places to fall with a fight. By the time everyone could see that Moscow had no real authority over its periphery states, and even before Moldova got its freedom, Transnistria declared independence from the MSSR, fearing that once it left the Union, it would join with Romania, which still had Nazi connotations among the non-Moldovan ethnic majority of the East. What followed in 1992 was a 5-month-long civil war between the two, with Romania aiding the Moldovan nationalists and Russian and Ukrainian aid for the Soviet diehards. Moldova failed to reclaim the left bank, leaving it to be effectively occupied by Russian forces. It was Boris Yeltsin, not any Transnistrian leader, who signed the peace treaty with Moldova, and to this day, the leaders of Transnistria still think power is delineated from Moscow. The leaders constantly give symbolic speeches appealing to Russia for protection. One in 2024 claimed that they were under the pressure of genocide. They weren't. And another in 2006 had even asked for Russian annexation, which most citizens at the time reportedly supported. But Putin's government declined, leaving it to be in the frozen state it has been for over 3 decades. Like most ex-Soviet states, the government's first action was to dismantle itself, transitioning to a capitalist market economy. Despite keeping up the act, the country is officially a capitalist one. And like most other ex-Soviet states, it botched this pretty badly, letting oligarchs gobble up most of the nation's key industries, turning it into an oligarchy. There are a couple of them, but really, there's only one sheriff in town. Sheriff! The company was founded by 2 ex-KGB agents, Viktor Gushan and Ilya Kazmeli, getting rich off of the fuzzy borders between Moldova and Ukraine. You know, the border that everyone officially recognizes is here, but they only have control up to here. Who will distribute goods in and out of this strip? Sheriff, though most people call what they did smuggling, particularly of cigarettes and alcohol in and out of Ukraine. During privatization, Igor Smirnov, the country's first president, gave much of the rights to the domestic economy to these rich smugglers, as they could offer the best price to the struggling government. As a result, Sheriff has come to absolutely dominate modern-day Transnistria's business. They've practically monopolized supermarkets, construction materials, food factories, electricity, gas stations, and media, owning multiple television stations and the internet. Some other sectors they brag about on their website include the country's best cognacs and wine, a modern restaurant and hotel complex, a full-cycle advertising agency, the latest achievements in sturgeon breeding, and their famous soccer team. As much as 60% of Transnistrian production is through Sheriff or Sheriff-owned companies depending on the year. Reliance on Sheriff has effectively replaced the role of the state during Soviet rule. Do I even need to tell you that Viktor Gushan is the richest man in Transnistria, giving the oligarch insane power over the country's politics. Some people go so far as to call the country the Sheriff Republic, and that's not just a witty remark. Sheriff has dominated politics, mostly through the financial and media backing of the Renewal Party. They've controlled the presidency since 2016 and the Supreme Soviet since 2005, trouncing the relatively small Communist Party. Every member of Renewal is tied in some way to Sheriff. Two of them, by the way, are the former co-founder himself and the other co-founder's son. The presidential campaign of Vadim Krasnozelsky was financed by Sheriff, who has spent his presidency defending the company, justifying it by saying they're the region's main taxpayer, which he is not wrong about. Just about a fifth of the government's entire revenue comes from the corporate tax Sheriff pays. On some succession tomfoolery, the one president who tried to challenge Sheriff's telecommunications monopoly was voted out by a massive margin after the media machine kicked into full gear against him. Though he was also highly corrupt and had to flee the country after his presidency. In a story, maybe true, maybe made up for the at-home audience, he fled in a tiny little boat. I'm not really sure how that tarnishes his image that much. The other lifeline of Transnistria's economy is their gas pipeline to Russia. Because the only power plant in Moldova is on the left bank, the free Russian gas had flowed here to be converted to electricity for both halves of the river, which effectively made Moldova dependent on Russian energy. About 3/4 of Moldovan electricity supply came from the Kuchurgan power station in Transnistria, giving Russia a powerful bargaining tool over Moldova. What if they just cut off the gas one day? Would they freeze? Collapse? Well, we don't have to wonder. On January 1st, 2025, the gas was cut off. This came after Ukraine declined to renew its 5-year deal with Russian state-owned Gazprom because you shouldn't do business with nations that invade you. The gas still could have been transferred through Turkey up into the Balkans, but Gazprom denied this, themselves ending the gas flow. Remember when I said the gas was free? Well, Russia never really saw it that way. They were loaning the gas to this territory, which they legally still consider part of Moldova. So they wanted the Moldovan government to pay back their debt on this gas, which by Gazprom's calculation totaled over $11 billion. Moldova said they only owed $8.6 million, as it stopped buying from Gazprom back in 2022. Energy is incredibly important to running a stable economy, especially one dependent on heavy industries. And during the Russian subsidy, a cubic meter of gas was 6% the price in Transnistria as it was in Moldova. 6%! That gave them a massive cost advantage over the right bank that perhaps they grew too accustomed to, as it was always dependent on Eastern European politics. You should never rely on Eastern European politics being stable. The Transnistrian economy shut down. Industrial production halved, with the deputy prime minister claiming all industrial enterprises are idle, with the exception of food production. Exports were down by 60% between January 2024 and 2025. In some energy-dependent sectors like metal and textiles, down 93% and 80% respectively. And the power station which provided the Transnistrian government a very large chunk of its budget had to switch to coal for some months, leading to rolling blackouts and the reduction of heating for at least 40% of the population. Without the gas revenue, the government admitted it couldn't even pay its own salaries and other essential payments, declaring a state of emergency over the severe general economic crisis in the summer of 2025. You know it's bad when your president has to literally promise to not allow a societal collapse, praising citizens for their great responsibility by collecting firewood to heat their homes. So why did Russia cut them off, knowing hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens would face severe hardship as a result? Likely because of the reason Transnistria exists in the first place. So Moscow could put their thumb over Moldova. The country, following the general Eastern European trend, has been drifting away from Russia's influence, aligning more and more with the European Union and Western Europe over the past few decades. Moldova signed a trade deal with the EU in 2014 and again in 2016, already shifting the direction of their economy, taking Transnistria along with it. From a quarter of their exports bound for EU countries in 2015, Transnistria now exports 80% of their goods to the EU. Then, in October 2024, Moldova saw a vote to put their commitment to joining the EU into its constitution, making it harder for future governments to back down from it. The yes vote barely won, alongside a vote to re-elect the pro-Europe Maya Sandu as president against the pro-Russia opposition. Both only won because of the votes of Moldova's large diaspora population, reflecting how controversial they were back home. At least we know which side of the controversy the Russian government stood on. Moldovan intelligence reported that Russian officials bribed people to vote their way, bussed and flew in people to polling stations, and launched a myriad of media campaigns, one warning Moldovans against the EU's gay values. It's not a crazy theory to propose that the Russian government is trying to create chaos, not in its little friend, but in its larger neighbor. Moldovans have also faced severe hardships since the gas was cut off, with electricity prices doubling as it's had to switch to more expensive Romanian and domestic sources. The price effects of this could ripple through everything in the economy, and we all know the iron law of democracy: the party who governs while inflation breaks out loses the next election. It doesn't always happen, maybe it's more of an aluminum law, but it sure holds up well. It's not all gloomy for Transnistria. Moldova lent the country 3 million cubic meters of gas, and the European Commission approved 30 million euros of aid to both countries, which was fully claimed by Transnistria, while a new, much smaller gas route started up from Hungary, with Russia paying for it again. At the same time, they rejected more aid the EU had to offer and rejected European gas, neither of which would bode well with their Russian relationship. The fact that Russia is willing to completely trample Transnistrians' well-being in an effort to play politics in Moldova, and they still go back to them, is a testament to how subordinate Tiraspol is to Moscow. Throughout this period, Krasnozelsky has promised to remain close with Russia, pleading for Putin to protect the country against foreign pressures. The foreign pressure he's referring to is not the larger power destroying its economy, but its neighbor diversifying its energy sources. Girl, that man ain't for you. The sheriff elites want to stay close with the West, as that's where much of their foreign business is done. They'd love for the border with Ukraine to reopen, to ship from the port of Odessa again. The last thing they want is to join the Russian market and become subjects to Moscow, whereas the elites linked to Russia, well, you guess where they would like their country to end up. Transnistria is inherently unsustainable. That's what happens when the entire economy is based on a parasitic model. It's caught in a weird symbiosis with Moldova, who is itself caught in a struggle between Russia and Europe. It's the official policy of Moldova to annex Transnistria, even declaring separatism punishable by jail time in 2023. And finally for them, for the first time in 3 decades, it's Moldova, not Russia, which holds the cards in the Transnistria conflict as the direction of its economy completely flipped. Yet would Moldova, a country committed to joining the EU constitutionally, like a substantial anti-EU, pro-Russia population if it were to reintegrate? Could they pay for the integration? They're already the poorest country in Europe. What would they do with the corrupt power structures that have been built up on the left bank? Russia would certainly take the country if it had the ability to, but without control over Odessa, they would just be creating an enclave to be strangled. Despite not actually being communist or state-run in any real capacity, the last Soviet republic does still take orders from Moscow. At least they have that in common with the Soviet Union it still likes to pretend it's a part of. And like the rest of the Soviet states, if Moscow no longer sees an interest in keeping it a part of Russia, it's not the Transnistrians who get to decide where the country ends up.